For a project like this, you don't need high quality lumber. In this case, I'm going to use number 2 pine boards, 1 by 4 by 4 feet long. For this particular sign that measures approximately 22 by 14 inches, check the website article for the exact dimensions, but you're going to need 3 boards. For those of you that don't have an abacus handy, that's going to run you $3.45. I started on the table saw sled, cutting each of the 3 boards in half. It's a rough length at this point. It doesn't matter exact measurement. After sliding my fence a little bit closer to the blade, I ripped 2 of the remaining 2-foot sections roughly in half, and then I ran the other section through so that they were exactly the same. This was going to make up the frame for the sign. With the 4 boards that I was going to use to make up my panel, I got out a couple clamps, and then I kind of sized up and figured out which surface I wanted to show. You know, it's going to be a rustic sign, so you kind of want the knots to show and different irregularities, but also to kind of mix it up. For these boards here, they were cut from 2 different boards, so the color is going to be a little bit different. So I alternated those, added glue to the edges, and then just clamped everything securely, kind of trying to even up the ends. Even though we cut them oversized, I still tried to get them to line up halfway decently. Then with a damp rag, I could wipe up any glue squeeze out, and while that was all drying, I went over to my computer and kind of designed up what I kind of thought would be, you know, the design for this particular sign. Green Bay in Wisconsin is actually one of the oldest settlements, and I thought it'd be kind of cool to have like a trading post, you know, one of the original mercantile general store type deals, and that would kind of correlate with the age of this sign. So I laid everything out, kind of got everything in place, and then my panel was dry and ready to come out of the clamps. After it was out of the clamps, I took it over to my table saw and just took off a little bit. I was kind of going down to exact dimensions, but again, it really doesn't matter how big you make the sign. So I ripped off one edge and then brought out my crosscut sled again, and then I squared up one end of the sign. Then I could measure how long I needed it and then cut it to its final length. At this point, I put some 80 grit sandpaper in my random orbit sander and just kind of eliminated some of the high spots and some of the large splinters. We're going to be distressing the sign and kind of antiquing it a little bit later, so we're going to have to go back over it with a sander, but just kind of to make sure it was all right to handle and there weren't any big, large, jagged parts. Now this brings up the fun part. Basically, you can start with anything. I had a file, a utility knife, I even had a spanner wrench to an angle grinder, a flap wheel in my angle grinder, and all sorts of different tools, nail sets and punches, and it's really kind of a random thing. I had a large bolt that I smacked with a hammer, got some thread marks in there, some nail sets, and an old chisel, and I just gouged up the area. I even had a little rotary rasp in my drill. There's really no rhyme, no reason to this. It's just make it look old, make it look beat up, put some dings in there, some dents, all sorts of different things. And yeah, you can take it a little bit too far, but it's just kind of a practice thing. And like I said, you just distress it and make it look old. You want to make sure to get the edges, so that's when I brought in the flap wheel to make sure that the edges weren't sharp and clean like they just came off the table saw like they did. Then using a saw, I actually opened up one of the glue lines and then used a chisel to widen it out a little bit and make it look like the board was splitting and that it's kind of been weathered and aged, and came back with a file and kind of smoothed it and weathered it. And like, again, there's no rhyme or reason to this. It's just kind of a fun process, just kind of beat everything up and make it look like it's been around the block a few times. This is when I brought the sander back into play, and I just made sure that any big, large splinters and any things that were hanging off were taken care of, and it was kind of smooth to the touch, but it still had that character. And here's the distressed panel at this point. It's not necessarily the best picture in the world to show it, but you kind of get the idea. Then for the long sections of the outer frame that was going to wrap the sign, I cut those to length at the table saw and made 2 of those pieces. Once those pieces are cut, I actually like to put those on either side of the sign and measure off of that to get my side pieces. Once I had that measurement, back to the table saw, then I cut 2 more pieces to complete the frame. Then it's back to distressing. I have the 4 perimeter pieces, and again, it's the same thing. Nail punches, files, saws, anything that you can. A claw hammer on the backside of a claw hammer works real good. A rasp, all sorts of things, and just kind of make it look old and beat up. Knock off some of the high spots in the corners and things of that nature. Come through with the rasp, and then back again with that sander with the 80 grit paper on it, just to make sure any of the real sharp stuff is gone. Then I laid out 2 1/4-inch MDF pieces, scrap pieces, to act as a spacer to make the main field of the panel, or the main field of the sign, raised up a little bit. Then I added some glue to the top and bottom pieces and secured that in place with a couple clamps. Any major glue squeeze out I could clean up with a damp rag. This shot doesn't show much detail at all, but I included it just to remind you guys that I am no relative of Ansel Adams. But in this particular shot, when I zoom in here, you can see all those kind of worn, beat up distress marks that I put in it. That's going to come into play when we add paint later. But with the end pieces, I also added some glue. I mean, we're talking end grain to face grain here, so the glue isn't going to hold it a ton. But then I could pre-drill for a few box nails and just hammer those in place and keep everything secure. Flipped it around and pretty much repeated the process. A little bit of glue and then a couple nails. I had 2 nails in each of the corners, but then I also added 2 nails on each of the longer sides, and I think 1 nail on... Yeah, it's mostly for aesthetics. At this point, I came back with a rasp and some of the other tools just to kind of knock down some of the fresh cuts, and also to remember, if this sign is a couple 100 years old, it's going to have gotten dropped, and the corners and the sharp edges are what gets dinged up the most. So make sure to distress those as well. Then it moves on to the base coat of paint. I started with the back just to kind of seal it up, but I didn't actually end up adding any of the faux finish or anything like that. But then I could go to the front, and basically you're just base coating this with just kind of a generic brown paint at this point. Nothing fancy here, just kind of seal it up. Then I can move over to some black paint. Just off camera I have a cup of water as well, so I can put the paint on full strength and then dip the brush back into some water to kind of dilute the paint and just move it around, and then with a damp rag you're basically wiping off anything that is kind of smooth and letting that black paint end up in all the little nooks and crannies and all the corners and all the distress marks that I added earlier. And this is a process that you can repeat. There's no magic, no science to this. That's why projects like this are so much fun. Coming back with that rag and wiping off most of the black paint, and let it dry. I mean, at this point, if you wipe off most of the paint, you can always come back and add more and more layers. This is after 1 layer of black paint, and you could completely leave it as is, just how this looks. I came back with a few more coats of the black paint, pretty much repeating the same process. You know, just dabbing the brush, stippling the brush on the surface, and then coming over with that terry cloth towel that's been dampened and just, you know, wiping away most of it. And you start to build what, you know, it's kind of like a grime layer, and just age, just it adds years. At this point, it's just kind of all a personal preference. If you want a super dark, you know, aged and distressed sign, then take it further. If you want just kind of a lightly weathered one, end it with 1 or 2 coats. While that layer of paint was drying, then I plotted out my graphics that I designed earlier, and I was going to use a vinyl decal to act as a stencil for my lettering. Once the plotter was done cutting, then I could remove and weed all the lettering, add my transfer tape, and cut that to size. Now with the dry sign, I could remove the backing off of that vinyl and create kind of an anchor point and come over it with an ink brayer and just eventually just put that whole sticker down, and that's going to act as the paint stencil. I went over it a few different times to make sure everything was laying down, then I could remove that transfer tape. With a smaller brayer, I went back over it to make sure I wasn't going to have any paint bleeding underneath the stencil. Tape on a little bit of craft paper to eliminate some of the overspray. Then I just shot it with a coat of gray primer. While the primer was still wet, then I could remove the vinyl and get all the letters and everything. And again, at this point, you could stop right here and right now. You could leave it as is. It looks just fine. It just doesn't have that fully weathered appearance that I was going for. So I took it a little bit further. Just to add some shadow lines, I took a permanent marker and kind of added some of the shadow lines, and then came back with some sandpaper and just kind of roughed everything up. Got some of the corners to make sure to show some of the wear marks, then also sanded away some of the letters in certain spots, and again, just make it look completely random. When I do this for set dressing for theater sets and whatnot, I leave it as is because it's completely flat paint, but I wanted this to have a little bit of protection, so just 1 or 2 coats of a spray-on satin lacquer.